Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the beautiful Garden Museum. It's my first visit here, and I'll definitely be back. My name is Susanna Hares. I'm the Education Programme Director and also a Senior Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. And it's my pleasure to moderate the event this afternoon. I'm a last-minute stand-in for Fiona Harvey. My apologies for that. Unfortunately, she's unable to make it.
Turn the room noise down.
I will do my best to moderate the conversation between the incredible speakers and panelists. I'm also really sorry to let you know that Vanessa and Kate is unable to join us.
Should we just give her a handheld?
Due to a last minute and pretty serious family emergency. I know that she was really keen.
This is stable. This is stable. We'll go with this.
Keep this one on.
Keep it on.
I know she was keen to bring the climate activist perspective to the conversation, so I hope we can cover that in the discussion regardless. And before I start, I want to offer sincere thanks to our friends at Malala Fund for co-hosting with us and also for supporting the event tonight. So why are we here? We're here because every year millions of kids lose access to schools due to climate and environment-related events, extreme weather, air pollution, and each year slow onset climate change makes schools hotter and damages the well-being of children and teachers. Harming the planet harms education. It increases the likelihood of internal displacement, of food security, damage to education infrastructure, and it has a negative impact on children's health and their well-being. And this is especially true for girls who typically bear the brunt of costly coping mechanisms adopted at household level. But in the past, these education issues have not been at the heart of climate debates. And the big question is, should education be a more powerful force in the response to climate change? Should it be front and central to debates about climate change and climate finance? And if so, what are the points where these two sectors most usefully intersect to advance both education and climate goals? Is this about adaptation, or is it through fostering climate activism, leadership among children and young people, influencing individual behaviours, or building skills to work in green industries and contributing to green transitions? And of course, once again, gender dynamics are at play here. Girls often lack role models in leadership positions and experience harmful norm practices that particularly impact their access to education in their adolescence. So I'm going to put some of these questions to our speakers and panel, and I hope to tease out some of the tensions for the education sector in trying to advance education goals at the same time as advancing climate goals. So we're going to start with some opening remarks from Laura Prudenti and Ziauddin Yousafzai, both joining virtually, and Laura with recorded remarks. I'll then move to introduce the panel. So starting with Laura, she's the Chief Executive Officer at the Global Partnership for Education. She started her career at the World Bank, where she worked for 20 years, holding several technical and managerial positions in Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. And she was then appointed Director General of the Italian Overseas Development Agency. Really pleased that she can join us virtually today. Here are her pre-recorded remarks.
Thank you to Malala Fund and the Center for Global Development for hosting this discussion. I wish I could be there in person. Today's event and the work being done by CGD and Malala Fund to generate a concrete research agenda is an essential first step to understanding and addressing the links between climate and education. The impacts of climate-related disaster in 2023 alone, from flooding in Libya, Cyclone Freddy in Madagascar and Mozambique, to heat waves across Europe and Asia, have damaged children's learning and are rolling back hard-won gains on SDG 4. These disasters are not gender neutral. Women and girls are 14 times more likely to die in climate-related disasters than boys and men. And if they survive, women and girls face devastating consequences. Girls often drop out of school, are subjected to violence or forced into early marriage, and are less likely to return. This is why climate-smart education systems are crucial. Education systems must adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change and be resilient. Donors and governments must support education systems and recognize the value of education to support future generations. Because we know that for every additional year of school girls get, their country's resilience to climate-driven disaster improves substantially. GPE is already taking action at the forefront of this agenda. We are investing nearly 1/3 of our education grants in resilience and climate action. For example, GPE is supporting Lao PDR to incorporate climate-resilient design measures in early learning facilities to prevent flooding, enable rainwater harvesting and tree planting, to protect school areas from erosion and landslides. Our technical assistance facility, the Climate Smart Education System Initiative, with UNESCO and Save the Children, will support 22 of the most vulnerable partner countries to mainstream climate change in their education sector policy plans and budgets. And with Save the Children, we are also exploring new ways of bringing climate funding to the education sector, including blending co-financing from global climate and education finance mechanism to support climate adaptation strategies in education. Tomorrow, in Copenhagen, I will join the Forging Futures event, co-hosted by GPE and Oxfam, in partnership with UNESCO, ECW, and UNHCR. Following the Africa Climate Summit in Kenya, the UN Climate Ambition Summit in New York, and ahead of COP28, we are bringing together ministers from donor and partner countries, activists, youth, civil society, and many more, in a shared commitment to solve the education, gender equality, and climate crisis. We will build on the discussions held by Malala Fund and the Center for Global Development today, and I look forward to working with you to ensure actions on all these areas. Thank you.
I think she's a real breath of fresh air in the education sector, and delighted that GPE is really leading the charge here. We're going to move over to Zio Dean now. He is a co-founder and board member of Malala Fund. He's the father of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Malala. I always think it's great to be referred to as Malala's dad. I'm definitely Roro's mum in almost all walks of my life. And for many years, he served as a teacher and school administrator in his home country of Pakistan. With Malala Fund, he's been game-changing for girls' education and his tireless advocacy for every girl's right to 12 years of free, safe, quality education. It's absolutely wonderful to have you with us today, and I invite you to make your opening remarks.
Hi. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First of all, I am sorry not to be there in person, while friends like Dr. Adil Najam and many others have come from far away. And I wished I could have been with you in person at the Garden Museum, but because of preoccupied, I had commitments here, so I couldn't come. But anyway, I'm virtually with you, and on behalf of the Malala Fund, I welcome you all, and thank you to CGD for convening this conference together with the Malala Fund on such an important theme, protecting our future generations. And I believe that we cannot protect our future generations without preserving the Mother Earth. So you will be soon listening from great researchers like Dr. Adil and Avinash Prasad, and also you will hear from great climate champions and education champions like Tamil Law, Amaluja. I'm just here to welcome you. As an education activist, I myself and our organization, the Malala Fund, we are well aware and we know about the intersection between education and climate change. we dream of a world where every girl should have an access to free, safe, and quality education at least 12 years. And that dream and that pursuit is disrupted by natural calamities, by climate change. So climate change is a threat to it threats and slow down the progress in girls' education. But at the same time, investment in girls' education is one of the key solutions to climate crisis as well. Personally, for Malala and myself, being from Pakistan, we know how much our country has been affected by climate change. Like, if I give just one example or two examples, from 2005 earthquakes in Pakistan, some 4,000 schools were affected and damaged by the earthquake. And I think half of them have been rebuilt and half are yet to be rebuilt. So you can understand that how much harm is done by earthquakes or floods to education, especially girls' education. Also, Malala and myself, we went to Pakistan last year and we witnessed ourselves the flood affected areas in Sindh. You will you might know that because of those devastating floods, like almost 1/3 of Pakistan was submerged in floods, and some 22,000, almost 22,000 schools were forced to close, and 3.5 million students could not learn. So that is the disaster and how it affects education in general and girls' education in particular. And it is not just about Pakistan. In Morocco, last month, the earthquake had devastated many communities which were already suffering from drought and land degradation. Like floods in Libya also damaged some 300 schools. And same climatic changes disrupted education in Bangladesh, in Brazil, in Nigeria. So the effects are both for boys and girls, but as the GPE had told in her remarks as well, that girls are more vulnerable. This climate change, climate disaster is not gender neutral. We see that when there are floods or earthquakes and schools and infrastructure is damaged, then girls' education is the first victim of that. Girls are pulled out from schools, and when they stay home, they are involved in home chores. Then they are married very early. There is also they are more vulnerable to gender-based violence at homes. So we see that it more impacts the lives of girls than boys. But at the same time, when we look the other way around, girls, and girls' education both, they could be panacea to this climate crisis. They are one of the key solutions to a climate crisis. And I say this because I believe that if we invest in girls' education, it can help create low carbon societies, green jobs, and more resilient communities. Also, we see like right now, girls activists and champions, climate champions like Greta Thunberg, Vanessa, and Talimor, who is there on stage, Aisha from Pakistan, who fights against climate change. So these activists, they have been empowered by education, and they are leading this climate change crisis, and they lead us. So you can understand how much education, girls' education, is important, and how can it counter. It's a counter phenomena to counter climate change. So, I have only 5 minutes, but to be very short, I will request you all that you continue championing girls' education is one of the key solutions to the global climate crisis. And as next month, the UN Climate Conference is going to be held in Dubai. So I hope that to the policymakers, we would be able to convey our message that girls' education and climate crisis, climate change, they are intertwined. So we need to invest more on girls' education and make our future generations safe. So this is all from me. And if if there is anything you want to ask, I'm here.
That was a really inspiring start to our event this afternoon. Can I ask you a quick follow-up question? I'll take the chair's prerogative here. Tell us what some of the solutions are for dealing with the worst effects of climate change on education that you think we should be talking about here this afternoon.
Thank you. This is a very important question, and I will try to be short. I think I will just tell a few things. I personally believe that education systems need to rise to the challenges of climate change. And first, I will say that governments who are working on education infrastructure, we should be aware of the climate change of earthquakes and floods. So the infrastructure which is going to be built, it should be seismic, like seismic. It should be climate proof. And also, we see that so many schools are built in the nearby rivers. So it's very important that if a school has been washed away beside a river, it should be rebuilt in a faraway place which is safe from floods. Also, we see that, as I mentioned before, that 4,000 schools were damaged in Pakistan in the earthquake of 2005. Only half of them have been rebuilt. So governments need to invest more on management of disasters. So more money, more resources should be given to it. And similarly, we need to have contingency or backup plans to have in such situation, whether floods or earthquakes, that we should have in place an emergency remote education system, online education system. So these are some important things which I want to bring into your consideration. But most importantly, I will say that we need like green curriculum. Green curriculum, I mean, you must have heard about this term. I believe that so far, in the last 2.5 centuries, we learned and we taught our children how to exploit the resources of this planet Earth. Now it's time that our youth, our children learn how to preserve this planet Earth as well. This is so important. So I will strongly recommend that we should have climate subjects about climate in our school curriculum, university curriculum, that our children and our youth are climate friendly, and we are not just after money, unbridled development, unbridled industrialization. So that's the last point. As a teacher, I wish that curriculums right from North America and Australia and Canada to Afghanistan and Pakistan, everywhere, climate should be a subject in the curriculums of our children, everywhere. This is so important. Yeah. As I said in the beginning, that we cannot protect our future generation without preserving this Mother Earth. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's some really interesting themes there that I hope we'll pick up on in the conversation with the other panelists, but very grateful to you for joining us. And if you're able to stay and watch,
I'll
then
stay.
you're very
Yes,
welcome
I'll
indeed.
stay. Off the screen, I'll stay. I'll be there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So hard act to follow, but we have an incredible panel with us here today. To my left, Professor Avinash Pasood, Tamilora Omojola, and Dr. Adil Najam. I'm going to start with Tamilora. She is Malala Fund Girl Fellow alumni who actively advocates for girls' education, girl-child rights, and other related issues. She has shed light on the effects of climate change on girls' education in her community, and she has led her peers in a variety of training aimed at increasing the capacity of girls and young women in her community and throughout Nigeria. I've really enjoyed learning from her over the last couple of days, and I'm sure you will do too. Tamilore, how can education prepare girls for a world affected by climate change?
Thank you for the question, Susanna. So I think the first thing I'm going to say is a story about a girl in my community. So in my community, we are often plagued with issues of erosion, and erosion comes as a result of flooding and poor waste management in our community. Sometimes it gets so bad, and girls are probably not able to go through a particular route as a result of the effects of the erosion, and you have to take a longer route to, for instance, school. Aside going to school, girls also are plagued with the responsibility of sorting market runs, going errands, and then having to do other menial duties for their households. Those are some of the slight effects of climate change on the girls' education. Longer route to school, which is very discouraging. On the other hand, I feel we should majorly be looking at the benefits that education would have on a girl who goes to school, or not necessarily going to school. Education for the girl about climate change doesn't necessarily have to be inside the four walls of a school where she's formally learning. As a girl, we learn every day and every time at home, amongst our peers, and even others. What education on climate change means to me is girls being able to learn about climate change and the positive behaviors that they could use to reduce the impact at home, amongst their peers. Imagine a girl as a friend. Most times as girls, we always have a group of people who we're very comfortable with and who are able to influence us even more than our parents. Imagine a girl as a group of friends who are peers and they're knowledgeable about climate positive behaviors, green behaviors, that they practice regularly. So you're doing something wrong and your friend is telling you, no, don't, let's do it that way. Let's do it this other way because this is what's best for us. Imagine we have that link or that chain of girls with their peers who are very knowledgeable about the green behaviors that they are meant to practice. Imagine that goes like a really long way. I mean, that means we have a chain of girls who are able to grow up, get married, and also influence their own immediate family when they are grown, and those families go on, and that's like a generation of a changed people who practice green behaviors. That's education from their household and from their friends. Also, education is also very important. I mean, without education, I'll probably not be here. I'm one of those people who was very privileged to get good education in my country, in Nigeria. But there are some girls who are not as privileged as I am. Yeah, so the quality of learning that they get is subpar. They're probably not able to read and write or even spell their names because of the kind of condition that their school is in. And that particular kind of girl who cannot read and write is unable to even read about climate change. So, for instance, she has the opportunity to read about it. She's unable to read about it, maybe only if it's spoken to her in our local dialect, which she'll probably understand. But one major key takeaway for me surrounding education and girls with climate change is girls do not necessarily have to be in a school to learn about climate change. They should be able to learn it literally anywhere in their communities, amongst themselves. And also, girls are always looking for solutions. They always find it. Yes. Even in the household, if, for instance, there's something not available, girls are able to quickly think about, oh, I could do this instead as an alternative and then get it done. Unlike the male counterpart, who really do not care because they believe that it would always be done. So the major thing for me about girls' education and climate change is girls should be able to learn about climate change and get information wherever they are able to learn, read, write, anywhere, not necessarily in their schools. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Malala. That's a really grounded and really rich set of insights into the links between girls' education and climate change. And so for those of us who sit in London, DC, what it actually means to communities like those that you work with. I'm going to zoom out a little bit now and hear from Dr. Adil Najam. He served as the founding dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and he's now the inaugural Dean Emeritus at the Pardee School, and also Professor of International Relations and of Earth and Environment. And since July, he's also serving as the President of the World Wildlife Fund. Do I just say WWF?
WWF is better, but
It's the panda for my childhood.
Yes.
One of the world's oldest, largest, and most respected environment organizations. We've also had the pleasure of having Dr. Najam with us for the last 2 days, and I've learned lots from him already too. So sort of building on what we've just heard from Tamilore, what should the education sector really be focusing on when it comes to climate change? You know, are there obvious places for climate and education to intersect, and where are they?
there are obvious places and there are many places, and those places are everywhere. And Tamilare pointed those out. Ziauddin Saab pointed those out. And I think the word that I'll pick from your conversation, I think the most important ones in some ways are behavioral. But let me say something that might be a bit of a surprise, which is many of those behaviors don't need to be, those behaviors don't need to be cultivated only in girls' schools in poor countries. Actually, the most pressing need is right here in the UK, in the US, right? And this goes back to the disaster. In some ways, if we are going to wait for disasters before we think about schools and education and climate, that is a great indictment on our entire species, right? That we're going to first wait for a disaster and then we will talk about it, right? So the most important thing we can do for girls' education everywhere in the world is to create a climate where there aren't those disasters, right? Because those disasters will always cost much more after the event. How do we do that? We do that by cultivating the behavior change, right? And that means consumption. So I want to put that right up front, because otherwise we become sort of this, this disaster chasing world where wait for a flood and then I will help you. That's the absolute worst time to do something. The right time to do something is so that the flood doesn't happen, so that the drought doesn't happen, so that the erosion doesn't happen. Having said that, the other thing, for example, again, picking up from what Zia was pointing out, the infrastructure of the school, right? That doesn't mean infrastructure is the most important thing in education, but there is a place where girls, boys, children study, right? Knowing that we are now in a world, because we failed in mitigation, where climate will change, we need to build those in a way that they become more resilient to the shocks that will come. And I think this is an important point, we need to make them places that are conducive to the learning, right? Because a lot of the learning happens in a place. If you're studying in a place where for 4 weeks the temperature is touching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, try doing that for 1 day. So what I'm trying to get to is that, as my colleagues have said, and as I'm sure we will talk about, we need to think about creative, innovatively, but also urgently about the various ways in which these two areas intersect. One of those ways, and I think the most important way, is first, stop climate change from happening. And a lot of that fingers point back to us, right? So we need to see that connection. Second, prepare our education system for the type of change that is happening, right? Which is whether it's in curriculum, whether it is in infrastructure, whether it is in the location. And third, and this also has been mentioned by both of my colleagues, prepare young people, particularly young girls, for the world that we are going to leave behind them. We have failed as a generation. At least we can prepare them for that world with skills, with understanding, with knowledge, with behavior that they will be living in.
Really interesting stuff. So moving forwards from that, how do we then identify the sort of action moments of action, and the champions who can help us influence education policy in that direction, sort of particularly multilaterally, but also nationally?
For
you too.
I wish I was smart enough to answer that question, to know that we are confronted with tough questions, right? That's what climate change is doing, amongst other things. And the reason I say that is, I do think we should also be thinking about who those actors are. Even in what I have said, I have fallen back to the traditional notion that it is this group of people. Education must be this group of people, and those are the two people that I'm talking about. We have a truly national planetary moment in which we have to think differently who the actors are. The actors are everyone who, like me, has spent a lifetime doing exactly that and nothing else in their life, right? So they're teachers, they are the students, they are the parents, they are the governments, they are the multilateral institutions, they are also students and people elsewhere, right? I keep coming back to this thing, that if we export this problem, right? You've heard this from me before. Let me say this again. Worry is, if we start making the most vulnerable, poorest young girls in the world responsible for solving climate change, when the governments of the world have failed to do that, that is beyond sort of unjust. We seek their help. We seek their guidance, actually, but we cannot put that responsibility on them. So similarly, in terms of actors, health system is a stakeholder in education and climate. The economic system is a stakeholder. Institutions, again, not just of ODA, not just of international assistance, but institutions, and I'm sure Dr. Prasad might talk about this, institutions like the IMF that create the economic in the vulnerable countries, that are able or put in herd them to act properly. So in a way, this is, we use this term, this is an all-planet problem. And so I seriously mean that we need to rethink who the actors are. I understand if everyone is an actor, no one is an actor. But let us at least broaden and figure out where those leverage points are. And each one of us, last sentence, if I'm here in Boston or in the UK, reduce your consumption, please, now. Right? If I am in Pakistan, let me at least put the shade outside my tree, so that when those extremely hot days happen, even if it's not a disaster, it doesn't become a disaster. If I'm a government, so on and so forth.
Thank you. And you provided me with the perfect segue to introduce our third panelist, Professor Avinash Persaud. His career spans finance, public policy, and academia, and he's currently the Emeritus Professor of Gresham College and an advisor to multiple governments on financial policy. Formerly, he was a senior exec at State Street, JP Morgan and UBS. He's chairman of the CARICOM Commission on the Economy. He's a distinguished advisor of India, and he's been a visiting scholar at the IM. He's also a former governor at the London School of Economics. Perhaps most importantly for today, he's also widely regarded as the architect of the Bridgetown proposals for reform of the international financing architecture. So can you tell us a bit more about what you think those proposals mean for education, and if implemented, how Bridgetown would benefit education, benefit girls, and also what you think the role of the likes of the IMF is in conversations like these ones?
Big question. Big questions. And look, let me begin by saying thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. CGD, Malala Fund, two institutions I have a huge respect for, and we're talking about my favorite subject, education. I come to you with the perspective of a government official in a developing country. If I think of the three things I'm most proud of in government, is we restored free tertiary education to everyone. We increased our minimum wage by 40%, and we are building about 10,000 affordable homes using solar power as a way of helping to fund it. And I mention those three things because climate isn't really in those three things. I think it's very hard to separate out climate from everything else we're doing in government. I got involved in climate first by being asked to help rescue Dominica from being hit by Category 5 Hurricane Maria. In 4 hours, they lost 226% of their GDP. Going around trying to support them, most people thought, how can you lose more than 100%? They lost 226% of their GDP in 4 hours. And what I learned from that, was that really climate is just a different window on the same thing of inequality. So the people who lost their homes, the people who are most disrupted, the people who lost their livelihoods, they were the same people who get impacted whenever there's a different kind of crisis. The same people are impacted the most by COVID. The same people are impacted by the global financial crisis. So dealing with climate is about dealing with development. It's about dealing with climate. It's about dealing with the same development, inequality, and poverty type issues. Now, today, there's a set of countries represents about 40% of the world's population, lies between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, different sides of the equator, 3.2 billion people who are climatic impacts, which can dramatically turn them from living fine to being plunged into poverty. And when they're plunged into poverty, then it has dramatic impacts on them. So we think of climate as a critical part of our development strategy. And a key part of that climate response is making ourselves more resilient to this changing world, this shock. The world has not mitigated reduced greenhouse gas emissions, is what mitigation is about, enough. And so we need to build up greater adaptation and resilience. We need to do more mitigation, faster scale, but already a lot of climate change already in train, built in. We need to be more adaptive. And for the thing thinking about education is that one of the reasons why we think of climate as a little bit of the tip of the spear in development is that it is the thing which exercises the world. We've been debating and negotiating on development issues for a long time without much headway. Climate comes along and we're making headway. And that's not something to be resentful about, because you can't do climate without doing development. But as I say to a lot of my development friends, people are not chaining themselves to the railings on the Sustainable Development Goals. They should be, but they're not. They're chaining themselves to the rail on climate. So let me do climate in a way that deals with the SDGs. Don't do climate without dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to build resilience. And I think my education friends need to think about, how do you get a share of the climate money? How do you get a share of the climate resilience money? So we're working on changing the global financial architecture in such a way that about $200 billion of money will come on building resilience. And much of that money will have to be borrowed because, you know, the total amount of aid in the world is $200 billion a year, and they're not about to double aid. As I say to my friends, people are not electing governments. So, you know, we could complain to ministers, but, you know, the ministers aren't being elected by people who want them to double their aid budget. They're being elected by people who want them to deport foreigners, not help foreigners. So we've got to remember this context. So they're going to borrow $200 million to build resilience. Where's the education resilience strategy? Because if you want part of that $200 billion, you need to show how education resilience, because resilience is about stronger buildings. That's a confidence, although even then that's not clear. I remember getting some Norwegian engineers to come and help us make Dominica the first climate resilient nation in the world. And I remember him looking at me and saying, well, you know, a collapsible bridge may be the most resilient bridge, because hurricanes don't happen spontaneously. You know, collapse them when you have your 2-hour warning, pull them back out when the hurricane is over. So we need to think about resilient systems, resilient livelihoods, resilient people, and education must play a critical role, the educational system. I'm not so sure whether it is necessarily what we teach, but it is a lot about how we teach. Take COVID. COVID was like amazing natural disaster shock. What happens? Our people are no longer in school, they're at home. Our systems failed those kids. It wasn't our buildings, our systems failed those kids. And we're seeing a huge education inequalities developed because we didn't have resilient education systems. So I think we need to think a lot about money is going to be spent on resilience, going to make a more resilient societies, more resilient communities, more resilient livelihoods, more resilient health systems, more resilient education systems. And you need to have that plan, because when that money comes, if you don't have that plan of, here is my resilient education plan, you aren't going to get that money and someone else will.
I think there's a lot of education organisations who are going to ask you to help them write that plan to get the resilience money. Thank you. You touched a little bit on people training themselves to railings there and the role of climate activism in sort of advancing this agenda. And I wanted to ask sort of both you and Tamilore what you sort of in this agenda. So Tamilore, what do you see as the role of activists in promoting links between education and climate change? And from where you sit, what do you see as the role of activists in sort of shifting policy and dialogue at the World Bank and IMF and
Sure.
kind of
You
folks that
want to
you
kick
spend your
off?
time with?
Okay. So I'll start. Literally, activists are able to raise their voices for, in my experience, girls who are not able to be in spaces like this, with leaders, policymakers, and those who make the decisions. One thing that is painful right now, that's a reality for me, is the fact that activists from Nigeria would find it difficult to attend the CS Cup because Dubai is not allowing Nigerians to be in their country. So those are some of, should I say, the challenges for activists to not be in particular spaces. Also, it's also important for activists to be at decision-making tables, not leaders making decisions for us. You do not actually understand the reality of the issues that we face. You do not live it. You're just saying and you hear about it. But activists are able to come up and talk about the effects, some of the realities and the situation and the happenings, the real life experiences of people in the communities, in their communities, and are able to talk about it for you to understand the gravity of the issue. Yeah, so that's what I'm just going to say about that. Thank you.
I've learned as I've got older that, you know, you need, there isn't one solution. You need to attack a problem with multiple fronts. And so whilst we're not working with at the same level that you are, and we are lobbying multilateral institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, we need the whole front. And in fact, you know, when we negotiate with ministers, my ability to persuade a minister from the Netherlands or Germany or the UK is largely influenced by what they think their electorates are concerned about and their activists are doing. So they're very, very connected. But I would say that, you know, we've got bottom-up approaches and we have top-down approaches, and both are important and necessary. But the reason why we have the climate we have is not because people don't know. It's not because people don't care. We have systems that make it very hard for that change to happen. And so if all of us became vegan tomorrow, the world is not going to dramatically change. So what all of us in this room, if the whole world did that, may make a difference. But the point is that, you know, if you think about it, the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases and global warming is our energy system. We don't get a choice as individuals on our energy system. Our governments choose our energy system, and our governments are involved in transforming that energy system to something more sustainable. And so we're working on how to get them to do that. And that requires some financing, because it isn't just about plugging in a solar panel. You've got to change the entire grid. You've got to change the entire power system. That requires billions of dollars. It's 2.4 trillion per year for developing. Individuals can't do that change. They're an important part of the process, but we need big changes. We've got to change our transport system. We've got to change our agricultural system. These are the three biggest contributors to greenhouse gases. And very few of those things are driven by individual decisions. Individual decisions are there, but they're not just driven by them, especially the energy component of that. So we're trying to work on what is the obstacle in developing countries for making this change. The obstacle is that is the cost of capital. All these changes are very capital intensive. It's very easy to say, oh, solar's cheap, but I got to change my entire grid. That costs a lot of money up front, which means I need to borrow money. And when developing countries borrow money, they're paying a fortune for that money. When South Africa borrows money, they're paid 12, 14%. When Britain borrows money, they're paying 4 or 5%. It is that difference in the cost of capital that is stopping and slowing the transformation in developing countries. So that's what we're working on. And it's great that we have other people who are influencing the ministers who, when they listen to our ideas, say, well, my people worry about that and they're concerned about that. So maybe we'll take some of these proposals.
Temilora, do you think they are listening?
So yeah, I think they are listening. Probably actions quickly and fast, just as we wanted. Yeah.
I'm not sure today. If I think about the environment we're in and the ministers we speak to, the ministers do not feel pressured to act in a major way today. I think they if anything, they feel a little bit less pressured than they might have done a few years ago. So we need to keep on those efforts. We need to redouble those efforts. But we need to we find the kind of arguments we have to use today is not arguments like this is what people are concerned about. It's like, oh, you can do so much more without using a lot of money if you do this. So one of the big things that has got progress from the Bridgetown Initiative is pointing out how much the global financial system can change without actually a lot of money. If every financial contract had a pause clause in it, so when a disaster happened, you had a breathing space, cost nobody anything. If the development banks, who are a way of leveraging $1 for $5, $7, $8, lent 3 times more, the amount of that cost is very limited. So we're focused on that because, unfortunately, our ministers are not gripped by a desire to change their budgets and put more money into it on these issues.
There are a lot of politicians just over the river, and there's some railings between here and there, I believe.
If I can go back to the activist question, because I think it's an important one. I generally agree with everything that's been said, especially about the system, including about the system, especially about the financial system and how it cripples especially the most vulnerable, poorest economies. Having said that, the part where I would like to bring some nuances, I cannot believe, and I do not want to believe, that we are powerless. I do not, and I know that wasn't the intent, but I do not want to believe that outsourcing all of our problems to someone else is just too easy. I believe what you said exactly about activism, but I don't want to live in a world where there are few people who are activists and the rest of us are spectators. Each one of us, I mean, if the crisis is actually as real as it is, enough talk, right? This annual sort of talk fest is not going to solve this. Everyone has to become an activist. And therefore, I remind myself that the root of activist is act. Right? Change yourself if you want to. But for God, act. Right? And I'm going to say something rather difficult, can I? Okay, am I amongst friends? We live in I'm talking about the US.
Friends and about 600 people online.
Yeah, online. Okay. 600, I don't know, but hopefully they're friends too. We live in a world where, especially amongst the young, the amount of actual interest, knowledge, concern for climate is off the roof. Right? It is real. The anxiety is real. You can feel it. I feel it in my children. I feel it in my students. I feel it in myself. And yet I'm a numbers person. The emissions are not coming down. Not even by those who claim to have that interest. I worry that we have gone into a performative phase where we all have the actual honest concern. But if I change myself and then go home to the 7 packages from Amazon, it doesn't add up. If I don't have a car, but I'm using my food is being delivered by Uber Eats or whatever, it doesn't add up. That Uber Eats emissions is not the emissions of the poor driver. They're my emissions, right? So what I'm saying is I'm joining you in everyone being an activist, just like, and the same with politicians. So I'm not giving politicians a scot-free here. I'm not giving, I'm saying voters, you have to act too. The politicians don't listen because we do not vote the way we talk about this. The businesses don't listen because we don't act with our wallet the way we say we want to act. If we did. So no, you are right. Exactly, you're right. I do not have the ability to change the energy system, but by God, I have the ability to change my energy profile. Right? And that has at least some bearing. So I know this is unpopular in many places these days, but I do not want to abdicate either my ability or my responsibility to have an impact on this planet. That is the only planet I have as of now.
Most definitely. But most definitely. But I think what I'm saying is not, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. What I'm saying is that our activism has not yet managed to change the electorate, because the electorate are not voting for that. And our ministers are looking at their electorates and saying, they're actually wanting me to lower the price of energy for them. And therefore, I'm going to import more coal today. They're not telling me I can raise the price of energy for this transformation. And so we need to change so we need more activism. We need more activism to both as personal behavior, but also getting the electorates to change, because that's the way we'll get government ministers to make bigger changes. All we can do today, because activism has not succeeded in changing the electorate, is do a fair bit around the edges, pushing them to do as much as possible without having to make hard choices. But ultimately, we need to make hard choices, but the electorate are not there yet.
I think I achieved a bit of agreeable disagreement then,
Sure.
which was my
objective for the panel. Thank you. That was a really interesting discussion. I'm going to try and come back a little bit more to education now. And one final question for Dr. Najam before I open up to questions and answers from the audience, and also to folks online. We had over 600 people register, and I can see their questions coming through. So please get your questions ready in the room and online. And Adil, it's not completely different to my first question to you. And I feel this very strongly after the last 2 days. We have, climate objectives, we have education objectives. There's a crisis in each sector. We call it a crisis in each sector. We have many people in education who want to, advance the climate and education agenda. How do we do that in each sector without doing a disservice to each one's own objectives?
No, thank you very much. And these are two sectors in crisis, but look outside that window, there are so many others, right? So we, as the US, they say in the US, we have to learn how to chew gum and walk at the same time. We can't afford to deal with one crisis at a time. We have to deal with multiple crises at the same time. And the worst thing that we can do is to pit crisis against crisis, right? So the first step we have to see is, where are those things in each of these crises where doing something will help something else, right? And therefore understanding the interaction, let's take education and crisis interaction between the two. You've heard this, let me repeat it here, at least in work I've been doing with one of my colleagues, Shahira Sayed. We're arguing sort of the climate acts as a threat multiplier to education, right? It has a crisis, but there are certain parts of that crisis that multiply when climate change happens. Learning loss multiplies because of climate change. Infrastructure loss multiplies when disasters hit. Development loss to the human physiology, to our anxiety, to our mind, to our body multiplies. Similarly, the contribution of education is that it can multiply some of the solutions. Right, it becomes a solution multiplier. It can multiply through green skills, so better solutions, multiply through green behavior, multiply through green infrastructure. But where we need to find, to your question, I think what all these communities need to do is, for climate people to say, okay, in the things that I'm doing on climate, where are those things that will help the climate cause, but will also help the education cause? For example, if I'm interested in green buildings to reduce carbon, why not put the first priority on schools and within that on girls' schools? Because the payoff is greater. If I'm an education person, let me look at that place where my education goals are met, but which also have a high payoff for climate. Right. That to me is the strategic way to go about this.
Thank you. You have a great way of sort of framing these typologies. That's really helpful to us. Okay, we're going to go to Q&A. I will warn the panelists that I'm going to come back to you at the end and ask you to give 1 minute of advice for the education sector on moving this agenda forward. So giving you a pre-warning to think about that as the questions are coming in. I think I'll go to the room first. Do we have questions? It would be great if you could say your name, who you represent, if anywhere, and then ask your question. And maybe we'll take, and if you're addressing it to a particular panelist, we'll take a couple, then ask them to answer.
Okay, is this mic working? Yeah. My name is Marinissa. I'm a final year politics and sociology student at Warwick. And I just had a question anyone in the panel can answer. I had a question about like global financial markets and how like they have like an impact on climate change and development in education in like developing countries. Because obviously we know that like climate change is like a political issue, and like there are countries like, you know, Pakistan, etc., who don't do like as much consumption, don't have like as much climate emissions, etc., as compared to, you know, like a global north, etc. However, we have like so much like expectations from like developing countries to have sort of like these like amazing plans of like development and everything, as you mentioned. However, don't you think like aid, it's for giving it out, etc., how can it sort of like harms these countries more because like of the because of like all the conditions that they have, and puts them into debt trap. What do you think, like, do they have like an obligation to sort of like help developing countries with like climate change, but also secondly they sort of like mitigate all of like the things that they have done historically and investing and take off countries? I understand like activism is important, but by we activism and like so much etc. It's like Pakistan is because like of like global institutions etc. who are like helping some countries have power to create climate in other countries.
Thank you. Big questions there. Hope you're ready. Let's take, and then we have Carly at the front.
Hi there. Hi, my name is Emily Lowry. I'm a consultant currently working for UNICEF on climate and education and violence. I've been a consultant for a while, and for around 5 years I've now done a lot of education and a lot of climate contracts, but just starting one on climate and education. And today's been great, and it's so great to see these issues coming together so much. I wanted to go back to the discussion around climate financing a little bit. At UNICEF, with some other organizations earlier in the year, we launched some research around climate financing, certain subsections of climate financing, and how only 1.4% of that is being spent on child-related services, and obviously education is a subset within that. And so I think when we talk about it, it's just so urgent. I feel like in the climate space, education just really feels like we're getting left behind. It's not, can we spend 2 years defining brilliantly what a climate, green curriculum looks like? I think, the negotiations happening now on the new adaptation goal that's coming out at this COP. It's only 2 years of negotiations on the new financing goal, how much is going to be on resilience and adaptation, and within that subsections, including education. These conversations and negotiations are happening now. So my question is how, as an education sector, can we place ourselves within those negotiations and policy discussions now, not in 2 or 3 years' time, like right now, because else I feel like education is going to continue to get overlooked. And just on that, I would also say that I worked on the Africa Climate Summit recently, and we had 900 applications to side events, and only 2 of them were on education. So like, where was everyone's applications that was in this room? I think we're already behind the curve, it really feels like, and there were like 50 on health, by the way. So yeah, I think like, what are we going to do really now to get in those conversations? Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Great questions. Did you want those directed to anyone in particular, or to anyone who wants to answer? Okay, let's take Carly's questions, and I'll ask you to answer any of the 3 that you want to.
2 questions.
And Carly's.
Last one, and I'll be
right.
brief.
Yes, few. Because I'm of an age where too many questions. I'm not going to remember them all.
Unfortunately, Avinash, this one is for you. So, but I'll be very brief. You mentioned it's one of the solutions is sort of the growing pot of finance that we're trying to cultivate is this 200 billion in lending. I think through the MDBs. I guess one thing that to reflect on, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is that if it is lending, then it's targeted to a specific group. And I think, we started this conversation thinking about climate change exacerbating inequality. And that feels like it requires grant-based financing to reach the poorest. And if the money that is becoming available is lending, then it feels like it'll be targeted to the wrong group. So just a bit of a reflection on how can we reach the poorest and the most marginalized, and is there momentum around that as well? Thanks.
Thank you, Carly. Avinash, why don't you respond to that one?
So I can remember them all. Okay, the 3 questions, sort of related, but I'd like to, because I think they're very important questions. So, we have global warming because rich countries have contributed 80% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And they didn't contribute that accidentally or in an oddly correlated way. That's how they got rich. Okay, so they contributed 80%. And so developing countries often say, look, you caused a problem, you need to solve it. The challenge is that today, the way growth is happening, developing countries are now 63% of current emissions. They're going to be 73% of emissions very shortly. And we've only got you know, I'm throwing out all these numbers for you. I hope, sorry, but we've only got a tiny bit of the carbon budget left. And so if we want to keep the planet below 1.5 degrees, we have to engage developing countries in that green transformation. And at the moment, we're not, because they don't have the financing. It'd be fantastic if there was $2.4 trillion of grants. They aren't any. There's no hope for grant-based money going up. I'd love there to be, and I believe all of us should campaign for it. And you should go out there and march and chain yourself to the railings. We've been doing it for about 50 years. It's not coming. Keep on campaigning for it. But we also need a solution for what happens when it doesn't come. All of the aid in the world is $200 billion, and they are double counting it, and they're reclassifying support for Ukraine as aid. A third of the UK's aid is actually spent in the UK on refugees and migrants in the UK. Are they going to double aid? We need them to increase aid by 12 times. They're not even doing it by 5%, 10%. So campaign for that, please. But we need other strategies. And so the other strategies are about, we need more grants, but the way we get more grants is saying we don't want grants for everything. We only asking for grants for things that we can't fund in any other way. But that's why we're going to be push on those grants. And we need grants for loss and damage. We need $100 billion of extra grants for loss and damage. But because we're going to mitigate the climate and we're going to make ourselves resilient by borrowing some money for resilience, getting the private sector to do mitigation, that justifies that $100 billion in this nexus of these three things. Now, on terms of education, I think that the challenge has come today where you cannot do education and ignore. You can't have an education plan and then ignore climate, because along comes a climatic disaster and it's all thrown out the window. So you need to have an education resilience plan. And that, you know, I sometimes say in the case of the Caribbean, because we suffer from floods and hurricanes, it's like a waterproof plan. How do you waterproof education? So you need to have a plan which says, look, if we had this climate disaster, here's my plan for how we're going to deal with it. And here's my plan for how we're going to do these things. And these plans have to be written down, and these plans have to be thought through. And it's complicated because, you know, we talk resilience all the time. What does resilience mean? What is resilience time? Does resilience mean doors of schools tomorrow after we've been flooded, or next week? Because the two are totally different. And is it next week or it's next month? Then what are we doing with the kids at school? Kids at home? And when the kids are at home, the parents can't go to work. And the big problem we had, I'll be 30 seconds left. The big problem we have in Dominica, you know, is that after the flooding, what happened? We discovered all of our climate refuges were the schools. And so the schools couldn't open for months and months because we had all these homeless people living in the schools. And because we didn't have the schools happening, we created all kinds of cascading problems. So you need to have an educational resilience plan that is about the system, not just about the buildings. And that way you can get some money.
Thank you. Tamilora, did you want to respond to any of the questions? I had one thought that I think I would really appreciate your perspective on, which was Emily's question around education being left behind. So you're really involved in climate conversation in your home country of Nigeria. Do you think education left behind?
I think it's also again, that's what I just want to say that's what the government has been doing. These conversations are really important because it helps to bring to light the fact that climate has a crisis of its own, education has its own, and we cannot leave education behind and then run with the new crisis. It's not new though, but the new awareness of climate crisis. So it's really important that we are having these conversations to highlight the fact that education should be left behind, but also included in climate conversations, because it's one of the main tools to reduce the climate crisis. Yeah.
Thank you. Adil, over to you.
You sure? Okay. Okay. I see the smile. Climate justice, Marinissa is exactly right. That's a climate justice question, and we cannot this question. For having worked on the justice issue for 30 years, my name Adil, by the way, rise from the word justice. Climate justice is being co-opted, right? What you described is the justice issue. The justice issue is that some people, me, are emitting way more than we should. Some other people, my nephew in Pakistan, are having to suffer for that. Right? That's the justice problem. That's the negotiation issue. It's nothing else. Right? So you're exactly right. On the left behind of what? 7% of zero is the same as 1% of zero, is the same as 90% of zero. There is no climate finance. It's a wish. There is no 200 billion, and right? We all wish there was a 200 billion. That's monopoly money. It is not as if there is a huge vat of climate finance and someone is being left behind. I'll tell you who's being left behind. Who's behind is the guy whose home was destroyed by the floods. I'll give you real numbers. There is no climate finance. We talk about sometimes this as if there is a huge pot of money, and now we are deciding how we will divide it.
So there's the
But
money.
there isn't.
There's the money, right? But Emily was also referring to being in the room where it's happening.
Sure,
Okay.
partly
Education
that. As a
often
negotiation person, I sometimes, this is a separate conversation. I sometimes think we need fewer people in the room, lock the negotiators up, and say you ain't leaving until you do it. You've been at it for 28 years. 28 years of failure is enough. Right? But partly they get away with the failure because we all get there and we turn it into a carnival. When we turn it into a carnival with those side events, I'm the king of events. For 30 years, every COP from before there was a COP, I was at COP -2, COP -1 until Copenhagen when I said never again. But the point is, but it's our fault. It's not negotiators. When we are all there, then the politicians will perform to us. It becomes an Instagram moment. Right? We all get there thinking that they will listen to us, but what happens is they are actually giving us the wordage for the next year's next headline, and therefore they are not actually doing what they should. But I don't want to make this about negotiation. I do want to make it about the money, and I'm totally with you. We all need to be there, but I'll give you the real number. One real number: floods in Pakistan. Just because A, I'm Pakistani, and B, it was recent. World Bank says, right, this phantom climate finance as if it was real. The World Bank says the cost of that is about 40 billion, right? Guterres, bless his soul, I love him, comes and the UN comes and everyone comes and they make these big claims and the pledges come and there's a Paris conference and it says 10 billion, right? We all clap. Now we are all salivating on how much can I get about this, me included. How much actually comes? Depending on who you ask, somewhere between 250 to 500 million. So what happens to the rest? What do you think happened to that 38 billion? Who financed it? Was it that it wasn't financed? It was financed. I'll tell you who financed it. The guy whose home was destroyed took the money that he was saving for his children's wedding, took his children off the school, not because he was a bad guy, but because you didn't have any options, because the IMF is saying, take tough decisions, get taxes out of these people, right? The same IMF that is saying it's going green. So what I'm saying is that is the honest climate finance. Climate is going to be financed by the poorest people of the world.
But that's where we are today.
Financed by the poorest people of the world.
That's where we are today, right? Now, in 6 months,
wake me up.
In 6 months, we've got $20 billion extra. Okay, in 6 months. So the point is, we have to develop strategies for, right? We can develop a strategy which says that we need $2.5 billion and you need to give it to us. Okay?
Because say please and they will give us. They didn't give it for slavery. They didn't give it for colonization.
Please let me finish. My point is that strategy has got us nothing.
Okay, we're going to move on. I'm going to take a couple of questions from online viewers, then have one more round from the audience. And we're pivoting quite a lot in the online questions. So the first question is one that's pretty close to my heart and the hearts of my CGD colleagues. Efforts to address climate change leads to more lead acid batteries that can increase lead poisoning, which has a negative effect on education. How do stakeholders address such risks to children? That's from Mark Engman. And then from Zelda Yamovich, adaptation and resilience finance is key, and an adaptive and resilient society should not ignore early childhood development. If we think about resilience, how do we avoid education being narrowed to pre-primary upwards and recognise lifelong learning? To take on lead poisoning. I'm looking at Lee Crawford in the audience who might want to take on lead poisoning. Any comments on that, Lee?
No, but I can't take, I don't know enough about lead poisoning, but I think those are both brilliant examples. That's the type of thinking that we need to do, right? On each of these interventions. We are in a new world, we are making these interventions sometimes, not sometimes, all the times in very good faith, right? But not knowing the realities of each other's turfs. That's the type of collaboration.
Yeah, and just a plug for some CGD work here, where our recent paper shows that lead poisoning is responsible for more than 20% of the learning gap between rich and poor countries. So if we are exposing more children to lead poisoning, we're going to be acting entirely counter to our education objectives. Early childhood education and lifelong learning. We should be starting climate education, climate resilience much earlier and thinking about very young children. I can see you nodding. Any comments on that?
I think that's important to do, but I would go back to say that, you know, the reason why we're here is the system we have that incentivizes the behavior that is happening. So we need to change the way what we teach. We need to make people open to an alternative approach, but we need to change these systems.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions from the room. Then I'm going to go to the panel for their 30-second to 1 minute advice to the education sector. I can see Lee's hand. Anyone else who's got a question, raise your hand too. Lee's just here.
Thank you. Lee Crawford from the Centre for Global Development. I say about lead poisoning and climate, but a couple of thoughts about the financing. First, on the activism side, what we hear a lot of from UK activists, from Extinction Rebellion, is about mitigating UK emissions. The mantras are just stop oil, insulate Britain. We don't hear anything about adaptation or loss and damage. And like, is there a catchphrase? Should that be a campaign? Let's pay our debts, right? Let's pay our carbon debts. And then from the other side, from the damage in Pakistan, the next time you see it's sensible, and would it be helpful to try and quantify and attribute some of that damage to climate change? Like, we know there were floods before the climate change started increasing temperatures, but they're now more frequent. You know, is it 10% more likely that there's going to be a flood each year? And so can we, rather than coming from a very big loss and damage number of 100 billion, can we have a concrete instance of saying, you know, here's a bill for Pakistan for this year from the Minister of Education to the UK. Here's, you know, we know that we can attribute X% of this to your carbon debt that you've incurred. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. Any other questions from the room? Okay, Latifa and Jack, could you make them quite short ones? Then we'll go to the panel before we close.
Yeah, I'm Latifa, I work for the Malala Fund, and just want to say thank you for the very impassioned panel discussion. My question is for all the panelists, and I already answered slightly, but when will governments take this issue more seriously, considering how much you've already spoken about, how much people are calling for them to take more action?
The Centre for Global Development. So increasingly we've got some evidence on the impacts on schooling and education, and there's a big discussion ongoing about how we're going to raise money to make these systems resilient and school buildings resilient and so on. But I often struggle to sort of find good examples of good responses, right? What have education systems done in order to react to these? Where should we be looking, and how should we be looking, so that if and when the money rolls in, we know what to do with the money to make these systems better prepared for future disasters?
Jack. Tamalura, I wonder if you want to take a stab at Latifa's question, when the government's going to take this issue more seriously.
I'm not sure I can answer for the government. Yeah, but then I know I can answer from an activist, saying that as activists, as Dr. Adil mentioned, we all are activists, or should I say, we all need to be where we are also practicing saying. So, for instance, from your personal practices, do you still have to order? Do you still have to always get a car, or could you just take a bicycle to reduce the emissions? Also, your demand for products that actually increases the greenhouse gases emission. For instance, in my community, the electricity supply is epileptic, and it's really expensive to get a solar panel system. And it's really easier to just purchase a generator machine which powers electricity into your house. So from a personal practice perspective, do we still want to keep demanding for the generator systems to power our electricity, or do we want to think about alternative sources to get power, which are cheaper for us in our community and are cost effective? I was also going to say something else, but I can't remember right now. So yeah.
Adil, any quick reactions to any of those three questions?
No, I agree. The governments are going to listen when they think we really mean what we say. We saw that in COVID. The impossible happens when it is real, right? If I say stop traffic in London, you'll say, you can't do that. But when the threat was real and we really believed it was real, happened, right? When I say 100 billion, this phantom number, it seemed it now seems like a ridiculously small number. It took, I come from the US, it took the US Congress 9 days to invent $1 trillion, 5 days to spend it. 6.25 trillion, right? Why? Partly because people believed it. So this goes back to, we all have to be activists, right? And we can be activists in various ways. You can be activists at the ballot box. You can, this is not to let the government scot-free. This is actually to put real pressure. Yeah. We know where the pressure counts.
We want to be activists. Avinash.
I agree. I mean, I think, I'm in the business of getting things done, not in having a great argument that is righteous and is morally correct, because that's important. We live in a very unequal, unjust, morally corrupt world. But that's not going to get my electorate anything for when I go for the election in 3 or 4 years' time. So we need to fight along multiple fronts. We need to fight for dramatic change. And we also need to not look for things that can actually deliver. So in the space of 12 months, we have a $40 billion resilience fund. We are spending, we in Barbados are spending 200 million of that 40 billion for it does not have education, not its plan, and they are not educational system like I deserve part of your money. So the money is being spent on where the plan is, and we have now got in the Paris summit $20 billion of increased lending for resilience and adaptation. People will get it when they've got plans. We're being campaigning for $200 billion of extra lending, in addition to the $100 billion of the loss and damage fund. And parts of those money are coming because it's a strategy that's delivering. And we need to think about the plans. We need to now start thinking the next stage of developing those plans.
Great. We need to get the resilience plans, education people. Okay. We're now standing between these good people and their glasses of wine. So in 30 seconds, each of you, what's your advice to the education sector, the kind of policy type sitting in this room? What should they be doing more of? Apart from the plans and all being activists. I'm going to start with you, Adil, and finish
I was
with
hoping you would end with
Mallory.
me.
Sorry. 30 seconds, and I'm going to time you.
Okay, 30 seconds, I don't know. I'll tell you what my advice to the climate people will be, right? And you can derive from that. I have been telling, and I will tell the climate people, don't wait for the education sector to take its money and put it on climate. This is a common problem. If you want to reduce emissions in buildings, focus on schools and focus on hospitals, right? Focus on those public goods that make the biggest, right? So by the same principle, I would everyone, every sector. Either we look at ourselves as silos, or we wake up to the truly planetary crisis we are in.
Thank you. Avinash.
One of the things we've learned is that resilience cannot be thought about in silos. You can't imagine you had a resilient school building, but all the roads to that building weren't resilient. Or the livelihoods of the people whose kids are coming to the school are not resilient. So you need to think about resilience in a systemic way. We have a plan we call Roofs to Reefs, which is really emphasizing that everything is connected. And I think the education people need to start thinking. And Pakistan is a tragic, great example. Let's all of us imagine a Pakistan happens to you. 1/3 of your schools are underwater. What happens to your education? And build a plan, but that's partly about defining resilience. That's the first step. We talk about building a plan about resilience. You can't do that until you've defined what is your resilience objective, both from education, but also to society as a whole.
Very good. Tamilore, the last word is yours.
Okay. So for myself, I'll say for communities, local communities like mine, we need to start redoing some of the solutions that I've seen that have worked in other communities. So for instance, there are communities that have green schools. For instance, the project of Vanessa Nakate, where there is a green school. Yeah, in my community, we might not be able to pull that up. But then there are bits and pieces of that initiative that we could actually make use of to be able to help and assist with improving girls' education without the climate effects in our environment and around us. Yeah, thank you.
What a great note to end on. I always thought this would be a lively conversation, and it really exceeded my expectations. Thank you so much to all of you, Adil, Tamilore, Avinash. Tazia, if you're still there online, thank you very much as well. I'm not going to say any more. It's all been said by these three wonderful people. Go enjoy your drinks, and thank you for being here.